started the first half of the first session with the question, would Abraham trust God with his most prized possession, his son, Isaac? Turn to Genesis chapter 22, and we'll find out the answer to that question. And while you're turning there, I just wanted to do a little bookkeeping thing here. There are blanks to fill in your workbook as we go along here. If you miss one of those, or if maybe I don't say one like I had planned on saying, be sure to go to the back of your book, page 74 or 75, and there are all the blanks, the answers to all the class blanks are listed there. So you can have those and fill those in at a later time, or even fill them in before the session starts. So, Genesis 22. This is my favorite Old Testament story. I'd like to read Genesis 22, starting with verse 2. God is speaking here to Abraham, and he says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering." I've got two sons. I can't imagine what I would do, how I would react if God were to say that to me. What was Abraham thinking? Sacrifice? Make a burnt sacrifice of my son Isaac? Well, they are told to go to Moriah. And Bible scholars tell us that Moriah is basically the area around Jerusalem. Here we have a picture taken from the Mount of Olives, and you can go down into the valley, the Kidron Valley, and then up to the Temple Mount, and that's what you see the picture of there. This is where Solomon's temple was located. Now you can see this golden domed building. That's the Dome of the Rock. It's a very important Islamic shrine. It is where the Muslims believe Muhammad went up to heaven to get the Quran from God. And so this is an important piece of property, a very controversial piece of property today. I'd like to read from Genesis 22 now, going on to verse 5. Abraham and Isaac are on their way to Mount Moriah, and when they get close, Abraham says to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we will come back to you." Now, this is really an amazing verse to me. Here is Abraham taking his son Isaac to Mount Moriah to sacrifice him, to kill him. And yet he says, "We will return to you." How could he say that? What was he thinking of? I'd like to read from Hebrews chapter 11, starting with verse 17. "By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was offering up his unique son, about whom it had been said, 'In Isaac your seed will be called.' He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead." Imagine the faith that Abraham had. He knew God had promised him descendants through Isaac, and yet God is telling him to slay his own son. And so he reasons in his own mind, well, God will have to raise him from the dead. And so he continues toward Moriah. Abraham was about 115 years old at this time. Here is a closer view of the Dome of the Rock, and it's thought that this is the very place where Abraham went to have the sacrifice with his son, Isaac. Realize that this isn't just a blind leap of his, a blind leap of faith. He had been following God for a number of years. As I said, he was 115 years old. God had been faithful to him. He had prospered because of the promises God had made to him. And he was sure that this was going to happen, that he could slay his son and his son would be brought back to life. Well, as we go through with this story in Genesis chapter 22, I'll be reading from verse 12. He is about to thrust the knife into his son. Imagine what's going through his mind when he hears these words, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." He continues on then in verse 16. "Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your own son, I will indeed bless you and make your seed as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your seed will possess the gates of their enemies, and all nations of the earth will be blessed by your seed, because you have obeyed my command. As we think about this, it's important to go to Galatians, once again, chapter 3 this time, and verse 16, to understand more what is being said here in Genesis 22. Paul writes in Galatians 3, "Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed." He does not say, "and to seeds," as though referring to many, but "and to your seed," referring to one, who is Christ. This is kind of difficult to cover, to explain, but it seems that Abraham is, of course, referred to as the father of our faith, and we are blessed because of his obedience to God. His willingness to sacrifice his son led to God fulfilling his promise to give his son so that all nations would be blessed. Remember the exchange of prized possessions I had on the screen earlier. There was a covenant made between them. They exchanged their possessions. And because Abraham was willing to give Isaac, God gave us Jesus, through whom we can be reconciled back to the Father. This is an amazing story of God reaching out, looking for people to trust him. And having found Abraham, he found the person that would trust in him, and through whom all his spiritual descendants would come. Well, I'd like to go on to the next slide, which is an Old Testament timeline. And again, this is in the back of your book as well. You can see the timeline there. Who were Isaac's sons? Here we have Abraham, his son Isaac, and you can see that is pointing, the arrow is pointing to Jacob. Jacob was the son of Isaac, and Jacob had 12 sons. And who was his favorite son? His favorite son was Joseph. And so throughout the rest of Genesis, chapters 37 through 50, we have the story where Joseph is the primary character. He's sold by his 11 brothers, and he ends up in Egypt. And he has God's favor on his life. And then we have the story of the dreams that Joseph interpreted for Pharaoh, and the Israelites ending up in Egypt as Genesis comes to an end. And so now with that, we will turn to the next book, Exodus. Turn to Exodus chapter 1, verse 1, and that would be page 3 in your workbook. You can see that with each book there is one sidebar that has capital letters, all capitals, and that tells us what the theme is, or a one-word a theme for each book. And the theme of Exodus is exit. Exiting the people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses led his people out of slavery to the Egyptians. Jesus leads us out of slavery to sin. We could divide Exodus into 3 parts. First is Israel's deliverance from Egypt. This is in chapters 1 through 18. One of the more important verses in this section is chapter 3, verse 2. There's a burning bush that Moses sees. And out of this burning bush, God is calling to him, "Moses, Moses, lead my people out of Egypt." And if they ask, "What is God's name? What should I say?" Moses asks. And God replies, "I am who I am." This is in chapter 3, verse 14. "Say to them, I am has sent you." This term, "I am," is a special word. It is the word for God's name. It was so important to the Jews and of reverence to the Jews that they would not even repeat the name. It was just the letters YHWH. We have added 2 vowels to this, and now this name to us is the word Yahweh. Yahweh is the name for God, and it's an important name. There are a number of characteristics that this name represents. I'll just call these the 3 I's. First of all, one characteristic of God is that God is infinite. He is eternal. He has always been here. Remember the creation again. You go back to the beginning, and God came forward to meet us. He has always been here. The second I is independent. God is separate from us. He's not dependent on anybody. He's not dependent on us. He is independent. He is above everything else. But not only is God infinite and independent, He is also immanent. He is close by. He is personal. He is a loving God that wants to have a relationship with us. Going on through Exodus chapter 7 through 12 are the 10 plagues. And the 10th plague, of course, is about the death of every firstborn male in Egypt. And the only ones that would be spared were those that followed the directions that the Israelites were given. They were told to put blood on the doorpost in their house, and they were to remain inside the house. And when the death angel passed over the land, anybody that was under the blood would be saved. Again, we see this red thread that goes through the Old Testament, where it's the blood, through the shedding of blood, that sins are forgiven and people are kept from death. Of course, the Egyptians didn't follow that directive, and all their firstborn males were killed as the death angel passes over. And of course, this was the institution and the first celebration of the Passover, the Jewish Passover. Continuing on, after this time, the Jews were released. And in Exodus 13 and 14, they cross the Red Sea. I have a couple of slides to show you about that. Here we see from Egypt crossing over. This red line is pretty much the traditional route. And here's the traditional position of where they believe Mount Sinai was located. I have another slide here, however. It shows some of the work that has been done by a man by the name of Ron Wyatt. I just did a little bit of reading on him, and here is an alternative route that they might have taken, where they cross over the Red Sea at this point. Here is the Red Sea extending down. It has these 2 bodies of water, these gulfs that go up. And in this instance, you could see where they would cross over the Red Sea by crossing over the Gulf of Aqaba. And here is the position, according to that idea, that research that they've done, where they believe Mount Sinai might also have been located. After the crossing of the Red Sea and ending up at Mount Sinai, we then go to the second part of Exodus, the establishment of the covenant. And this is done in 3 different parts. First of all, there was the receiving the covenant, taking possession of the stone tablets. Next, it was learning about the covenant. Just having Moses read the covenant to the people, kind of getting a head knowledge of what the commandments, the 10 commandments, and what the covenant is all about. And the third part, in establishing the covenant, was for them to actually live it out, to take it from their head into their heart, and to be formed into God's people. Next, the third part of Exodus has to do with building the tabernacle. The tabernacle is the tent of meeting, which they were in for the 40 years in the desert. And later, this became the temple, such as Solomon's temple, when they were in Jerusalem. Here are some slides that will show some of the things that were happening there in the Sinai. You see the 12 tribes that surround the tent of meeting. Here we have the brazen altar and the tent of meeting, which are, show you a close-up of that right here. The brazen altar, again, that's where the animals would be sacrificed. And it reminds us again of this red thread, of the shedding of blood as animals would be killed and sacrificed. That, as a place of sacrifice, a physical sacrifice, you could say, represents our body, the physical sacrifice that we make in serving Christ. Next, we have the holy place. That is the first room in the tent of meeting. And in this area, we see that there are 3 pieces of furniture. There is a lampstand that speaks of our intellect, our mind. There's a table of showbread, where fresh bread would be put on that every day by the priest. And it represents our emotions, our fellowship, our relationship with others. The third piece of furniture is the altar of incense. This altar represents our will, what we choose to do, whether we choose to obey or not. And in the last room here, referred to as the Holy of Holies, we have the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat that sits on top of it. Here is a close-up view of that. There were seraphim that formed this area here, and this is where God resided, in the Holy of Holies. He resided there above the mercy seat and above the Ark of the Covenant, where the 10 Commandments were placed. Here we have again a picture of the tent of meeting, and this time I would just like to point out the veil that separates the Holy of Holies from the holy place. Priests would go into this first room daily, but once a year they would go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and the sacrifice would be made, which would be lead to the forgiveness of their sins for the previous year. And so this veil separated them from God's presence. And we know that in Hebrews 4:16, we are told now that as believers, as Christians, we can approach the throne of grace with boldness, because that veil has been removed. In Matthew 27, verse 51, we're told that at Jesus' death, this veil was torn from top to bottom. God did the tearing through what Christ did for us on the cross. And now that has opened up the way into God's throne room so that we can now have access to Him. With that, let's go on to the next book, Leviticus. Now, is this anybody's favorite book? There's only so much we want to know about bodily discharges and defiling skin diseases. Well, this book, as you can see, the theme on page 4, it's all about priestly duties. Moses was a priest. He was a mediator, an intercessor between God and the Israelites. And in the same way, Jesus is our high priest. Notice the word Levi in the title, the first 4 letters. Who were the Levites? Well, Levi was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And they were chosen to be the priests. But why were they chosen? Well, there's a story in Exodus chapter 32 that I alluded to earlier, where Aaron was forming a golden calf, an image. And when Moses came down off the mountain and saw that, he was very mad. And God was upset with them as well. And Moses asked, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And it was the Levites that gathered around him and followed him. They were faithful, whereas the others were turning from God. And so, based on that, the priests that serve God in the tabernacle and later in the temple are the Levites. In the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, we are told that we are a royal priesthood. As believers in Christ, we are to be the intermediaries, the mediators between God and those we come into contact to, being witnesses to them. In Exodus, God instructed Moses to build the temple. In Leviticus, God instructed Moses in the use of the temple and the tabernacle. And so, let's go to chapters 1 through 10, where we learn how to approach God through sacrifice. There were 5 offerings that we read about in the book of Leviticus. And so regarding the blanks in your workbook here, notice that burnt offerings speak of Christ's death. In the burnt offering, everything was totally burned up. The grain offering, that speaks of Christ's perfect life. The third offering that's mentioned in Leviticus is the peace or the fellowship offering. And that speaks of communion, of having a common union with Christ. And this offering was eaten. And that's where we get the idea of communion today when we celebrate communion in our church services. The bread we take is Christ's body that was given for us, and that speaks of the grain offering. The wine or the juice that we take represents His blood that was poured out for us. That is a reference to His death on the cross and speaks of the burnt offering. And we take this bread and this wine in remembrance of Him when we take communion. The last 2 offerings, the sin offering, represents our sin nature. The trespass offering represents or speaks of our individual sins. And we'll talk more about these offerings when we get to the book of Romans in the New Testament. Next, how do we walk with God? We approach God through sacrifice. How do we walk with God? In 3 ways. First of all, in holiness, by coming into His presence. In Leviticus 11, verse 44, we are told, "You are to be holy because I am holy." We walk with God in sanctification. We are set apart for Him. This is a growing process. After coming to know Him, we are sanctified. We become more and more like Him. In Leviticus 20, verse 26, "I've set you apart from the nations to be mine." And third, we walk with God in obedience, living faithfully as His people. In Leviticus 26, verse 3, "If you follow my statutes and observe my commands, I will bless you." Well, let's go on to the book of Numbers. The theme of Numbers can be summed up with the one word, failure. If you look in the first verse of Numbers, you can see that they are now at this point that Numbers is being written about 13 months after they escaped from Egypt. So they basically had a 1-year seminary around Mount Sinai as they built the tent of meeting and they learned about the covenants and incorporated it into their lives. And now they're ready to enter into the promised land. But there's something that happens that delays them. So, in chapter 1, chapter 1 through 9, we see that they are preparing to enter the promised land. They did this primarily in 2 ways. First of all, militarily, by taking a census. They counted up all the males over 20, and there turned out to be 603,550 males who were fit to fight in a battle. If you imagine that each of these males was married, and even if they only had 2 children, you're talking about 2.5 million people that Moses was responsible for and leading in the desert. A pretty big task. Not only did they prepare militarily, but they prepared spiritually. In chapter 9, verse 1, they observed the Passover, and then they set out on their journey. But when we get to chapter 10, we start to read about their failure to enter into the promised land. And why did they fail? It was due to a negative report. In chapter 13, verse 2, 12 men were sent out to spy on the land. And in chapter 13, verses 27 through 33, they come back and make this negative report. We can't go up against them. Yes, the land is flowing with milk and honey, but the cities, they are large and they're fortified, and the people are strong and huge. We seem like grasshoppers in comparison. And so in chapter 14, we read that they remained in the wilderness. But God promised that none of the men who saw the miracles that God had performed in Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, everything that had happened to them so far in the wilderness, those that rejected him and didn't trust him to be able to lead them into the promised land, those people would die and never see the promised land. All of them died except for two people, the two that came back with a good report that encouraged them to go right into the promised land. And those two were Joshua and Caleb. And so what can we learn? To not trust in God resulted not only in a dryness for them as they remained 40 years in the desert, but it's a dryness for us as well. We, when we don't trust in God, go through our own desert experience. Next, starting in chapter 26, we see that a new generation has come to life. Those that didn't trust God have died, and now this new generation is ready to enter in. They are given a second chance to enter the promised land. In chapter 26, verse 2, a new census is taken, and they begin marching toward the Jordan River. Here we have a picture of the Dead Sea, the Jordan River that flows into the Dead Sea, and this is where they are encamped on the eastern shores of the Dead Sea and of the Jordan River. They are on the plains of Moab. This is got a picture of this. It is a picture of the Jordan River just to the north of where it empties into the Dead Sea. This picture was taken on the west side of the Jordan River. And so on the other side is the nation of Jordan, on the other side of the river. This is not only where they believe Joshua crossed the Jordan River into the promised land, but it's also believed to be the same place where Jesus was baptized years later. Well, that brings us to the end of Numbers. And so now we'll go on to Deuteronomy. The key word in Deuteronomy is the word listen. Why is this book of Deuteronomy necessary? The new generation was ready to enter in. They had their Passover. They had taken the census. Why not just go on in? Why delay and have this book of Deuteronomy? Why not go right on to Joshua, leading them across the Jordan River? Well, this new generation, new Israelites, the old ones had died. This new generation now needed to be reminded of God's law and of their covenant relationship with Him. And so in Deuteronomy, Moses gives three messages or three sermons. First of all, in chapters 1 through 4, we have Moses' first sermon, a review of God's protection of Israel while they were in the desert. Next, we have Moses' second sermon, a review of the law of God. They had a head knowledge of it, and now with the Ten Commandments, the offerings, the festivals, they are being shown and just read again what this law is about for those that maybe weren't familiar with it. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, in this section that contains Moses' second sermon, is Judaism's basic confession of faith. Very important verses. And it starts with this word, listen. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. This was recited every morning and evening. It is referred to as the Shema, which is the Hebrew word for listen or hear. One way to remember this is that it appears 34 times in Deuteronomy. The word Shema or listen only appears 26 times in the first 4 books, Genesis through Numbers. But it appears 34 times in Deuteronomy. And there happen to be 34 chapters in Deuteronomy. So that's maybe one way that you can remember that and the importance of this word to listen, to hear. And what are they to listen for? And what are we to listen for? That God loves us. Deuteronomy is very much a message that we don't think of often in the Old Testament. We think of God's love in the New Testament, but you can see that in the book of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 4, verse 37, God loved your fathers and brought them out of Egypt. In chapter 7, verse 8, the Lord loved you and kept the oath He swore to your fathers. And later in chapter 7, verse 13, God will love you, bless you, and multiply you. Deuteronomy personalizes the relationship between God and His people. In Leviticus, we see that instructions are given to the priest in a rather technical way. But in Deuteronomy, when we read the first verse of Deuteronomy, it says that these are the words to all Israel. Leviticus was just to the Levitical priests. Deuteronomy is to all the Israelites. In Leviticus, we also have all of the feasts described. And again, they are done in rather dry terms. But when you look at Deuteronomy, these same feasts are repeated. And there, it's a celebration. In chapter 16, for example, they are told to celebrate and rejoice during your festivals. Have abundant joy. And so it's a book, the book of Deuteronomy, that reveals God in a special way and shows His love for His people. Next, the covenant of God. This is Moses' third sermon, and it's a review of this covenant that he had made with them. Instead of just showing the head knowledge, again, he brings it into a heart level. He brings it into their heart so that they will be obedient and follow Him in all their ways. Starting in Deuteronomy 27, Moses tells the people, "Obey the Lord and follow His commandments. On the day that you cross over the Jordan River," he told them to stand on these two mountains. Mount Gerizim represents the blessings of Israel. 6 tribes, 6 of the 12 tribes were to be on this mountain. And those were considered to be blessed. It represents blessings. The other 6 tribes were to be on Mount Ebal. And that represented the curses for not being obedient to God. And so Moses told them that that is what they were to do, to emphasize the idea of the obedience that they needed to have toward God. So we have Moses' charge to Joshua and to Israel. And then it tells us of Moses' death. He was in Moab on Mount Nebo. And this is a picture of Mount Nebo. This rise there, you probably can't see it, but there are some white buildings there. It's a church that is built to commemorate where they believe Moses died and where he was buried. After all the miracles that the people had seen God do, the plagues, crossing over the Red Sea, the manna, the water that they were given, the spies still gave a bad report based on seeing giants in the land. They didn't trust that God could help them. What about me? Am I trusting in what only I can see, or am I walking by faith, trusting Jesus and what His Word promises? And if I've placed my trust in Jesus, being a child of His means being His representative. Am I representing Him well? Am I the witness that He's calling me to be? That's all for session 1. Next, we'll start with session 2, In the Promised Land. The homework for that begins on page 6 in your workbooks. And I'd just like to mention, as you go looking at the homework, there are 5 days of homework before the next session. And so I encourage you to do that. It fills in a lot of the gaps, the things that I didn't have time to cover. And so before the next session begins, please do those 5 days of homework to get the most out of this class. Also remember the memory work I've given you. I urge you to try and learn the books of the Bible. For next time, we'll say Genesis through the Song of Solomon, and also the memory verse, 2 Chronicles 7:14. I'd like to close with this blessing from Numbers 6, verses 24 through 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. Thanks for joining me.